Hey friends, welcome back. We're kind of coming to the end of this
No, this is
series.
just the beginning.
Just-
Good Friday
oh, yes.
is the beginning. It's not the end.
I'm saying our podcast time.
Man, Jenny, haven't you learned anything?
I've learned nothing. All right, so we've made it to Good Friday.
Yep, so today's topic is Good Friday, but again, in context, there's been a huge journey before this.
Yep.
I don't have to go back and go day by day, but context is really important.
Yes.
And I think, like, typically from the church perspective, the contemporary church does a great job celebrating Good Friday, as if this is the beginning to
Easter.
the Easter
Yeah.
journey, right? And so, if anything, think about the context that has brought us here to Good Friday to define why is Good Friday good? Because there's been this journey of the invitation into a place of the desert, the giving up of something that has not been beneficial or good, almost stepping into death itself, and then the whole Palm Sunday journey and finding almost that the desert had been holier than the holy city itself. The idea of the fig tree that had been cursed, the experience from our own experience of that fig tree, the calling out of the Pharisees and Sadducees, the hypocrisy, this whole journey of death and the telling of truth of our own selves and culture and society and all those things. And this brings us to Thursday, where Jesus breaks the bread and he offers the cup and says, "This is me," as a prophetic and a summation of the things that are going to bring us out of this journey of death. Is his body broken and then his blood spilt, and this brings us to the actual action of that. And in church culture, it's called Good Friday because this is the end of death.
Yeah. So there is a ton that happens in this day, and we're not going to be able to cover it all.
We're going to cover every.
He's wrong.
We're right.
Yeah.
And I would really recommend at least reading one of the Gospels accounts of this, if not all four. Like I did that before we came here, and I don't know, it's crazy how many times we've like talked about this and been to Good Friday services or done them, and you forget like so much of the story, how important it is to like read it over and over again. So there were different bits and pieces that just kind of like stuck out to me. That
Are you able to kind of share some of the things about atonement, about the crucifixion, about the beating? Like, what are the things that through the journey of the Good Friday understanding and experience that capture your heart, that you would say, here are some things that I'm going to sit in and hold on to?
Yeah. So a few things stuck out to me. One was yesterday, like when he broke the bread and said, "This is me." That was kind of the beginning of Jesus ending this line of like asking questions and letting people kind of come to their own conclusions. And now he's like, all right, it's time. And he's just kind of like letting it happen. And in the context of letting it happen, it's like how Good Friday starts is like they're in the garden and Judas comes with this band of soldiers, and Jesus very clearly surrenders. Like he doesn't put up a fight. He even stops disciples from putting up a fight. And he tells them this is all meant to happen, and that is the exact moment that they all run away, which is like pretty striking. It's not when the soldiers come. It's not when Peter cuts off the ear and things get really serious. It's when Jesus says, "I'm letting this happen," that they flee. And there's something to that where just thinking from the perspective of those people, it's like everything that we've been talking about this week has built up to a point where Jesus says, take me.
Mm,
So that's the first thing that stands out of just like, whoa, that's probably not what was expected.
that's good.
Then there's a moment after that, like a while after that, where we talked about Judas on Wednesday. And for me, this is the moment where things come full circle. Like Judas, like he sees all this go down and he's just like grieved by what is happening, which we talked on Wednesday where that could be coming from. Maybe he misunderstood the plan, or like maybe he came to like his senses or whatever, but he does this incredibly symbolic thing where he was paid 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus, and he goes back to the temple and he tries to give it back and they say no, and he throws the 30 pieces in the temple. There is this story in Zechariah 11. Do you know about this?
No.
Okay. So in Zechariah 11, Zechariah, he's talking about, like he paints this picture of a shepherd that comes to rescue this flock of sheep, because the shepherds over this flock of sheep, they only view them as profit. Like they don't actually care about the sheep. So the shepherd comes and he kicks out the bad shepherds and he takes over the flock. But then the flock turns against him to the point where he has to leave. On his way out, he returns what he was paid and he throws 30 pieces of silver into the temple. And he says, "Woe to my worthless shepherd who deserts the flock."
Oh,
So when Judas
Wow.
throws 30 pieces of silver into the temple, like almost all of the people, but especially the people who work within the temple, have this part of the Bible memorized through and through. As soon as they see 30 pieces thrown into the temple, the connections start being made. Like Judas is criticizing the priests for being worthless shepherds.
it's so good. That's really good. I enjoy how on Good Friday there's such a high quantity of all the dots are beginning to be like brought together from a biblical perspective. It's kind of like biblical time and space all collide here, and like all of it has a vocabulary now in a physical form. Like if a sacrament is a physical example of a spiritual happening, like the body of Jesus himself, God himself, is the sacrament. He is the spiritual happening of everything that has happened and is going to happen, colliding into this space. I mean, just simply, it's very common that on Good Friday people will talk about Passover a ton.
Right.
This is the Passover season, and the idea of atonement, and Jesus is dying for everyone's sins, and it kind of all gets balled up in that. But you think about the entire Exodus story, right? And what Passover is. It was, putting blood on the doorpost so that your children could be saved, so that you would be set free from the captor, set free from Pharaoh who had you in slavery. And the dominant culture is Babylon. So even though it's Egypt, there's this idea of Babylon, being captive, a slave of Babylon, and then the parting of the sea following it, the idea of symbolism of baptism here. They had been slaves and they are now free, and the catalyst to all of this happening had been the blood on the doorpost of the lamb that protected this household, had been a symbol of faith, so that your firstborn son would not die, but the firstborn of Pharaoh's died. And then somehow in this whole vocabulary of things, this is God's only son who is being sacrificed. Ugh.
Yep.
Yep. There's a lot going on, and this is the feast of Passover that is happening during the Easter season. And that's Palm Sunday. Like
Hmm.
it's a Passover festival that is happening. This idea of the salvation of people is at hand and celebrated. The elders are telling their children, do not forget who God is as a God of salvation, a God of atonement, a God of sacrifice. Like this vocabulary is dripping all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like everything gets sucked in to this one moment. Like all of the arrows are pointed to this one moment. And then there's arrows pointing from this moment like outward too, of just like tying back into those things. It's not just like towards, it's like out, and it all cohesively ties together.
Yeah.
It's pretty wild.
So thinking about Good Friday, what are the things that have brought you to this day that brings value? L- like seeing yourself at the foot of the cross. What has brought you here from our journey?
I think for me, like ever since we started the beginning of Lent, this, even in like thread throughout all of our conversations this week, talking about our own humanity and like even the way that Lent starts, like you are dust and from dust you shall return. And finding a lot of value in the concept of death and suffering and Jesus is entering into it. I think we often view Good Friday as part one of a part two, and we miss the value of part one, like as if there is no conclusion within Friday itself, but all of the conclusion happens in Easter. But it was a couple days ago, like you were talking about, just like this question of like when someone is suffering and they're asking like, "Where's God?" It's like He's right there, and just this concept of, I think maybe the most common way God responds to suffering is by entering into it with you. Like He co-suffers with you, and the suffering that Jesus is doing, He is doing it not just for us, but with us. Like He is being brought to the outskirts of the city where the unholy people are. He is getting put on a cross next to the zealots, the betrayers, the outcasts of society, like being executed in a way that was designed to cause people to be erased from the record and forgotten. So the lowest of the low, those are the people that He is with to the very end, in this act of solidarity with them. Not in the sense of like He goes down to come back up, which is true, but we can't forget the fact that like He goes down and He says, "These are my people. These are the ones I'm going to die with." There, in a couple of books that I've read recently, they tell the same story about something that happened in Auschwitz, where the soldiers overseeing the Jews in Auschwitz, they made an example of one of them. And I won't get into detail, it's kind of graphic, but this Jewish person, he's dying in front of these people, and someone in the crowd says, "Where is God?" And the person who tells this story, he says, he pointed at the person dying and he said, "There is God." That's where He is, like pointing to the cross. Like this is the example of Jesus. Like He co-suffers. He is in the suffering. And if we move too quickly to Easter, we forget how lucky we are and how gracious God is that He would join us in our suffering. And that is the way that He responds to that suffering. And like even the symbol of the cross, we've turned it into the symbol of victory, when it really is a symbol of suffering. And there's so much value in seeing the cross as a symbol of suffering, because if we see that, we realize in our suffering, we are not alone. We don't have to wait for our suffering to end before we can say, "God is with me." We can be in the midst of our suffering and know God is with me.
And can I just like point out to just this journey, because the vocabulary that you're sharing is God with us.
Yeah.
Um, that the journey of the cross brings us back to the intent of God when he came here. Going back to the prophecies, his name will be called Emmanuel. Hmm. God with
Yes.
us. He
Yes.
came to be with
Yep.
us. And there's so much here in this idea of suffering, that he came to be with us. And Easter is this journey of him inviting us to be with him.
Yep.
Mm.
Yep.
And I think that's really important to be like, there is so much value in the name of Emmanuel, God with us.
Yep.
Because if you don't see that and you bypass Good Friday and you bypass this whole journey, the whole conversation in our head is, how do I get good enough to be with him?
Yeah.
How do I do all the things? And that's been what the Holy City was all about forever, right? How do I get to be with him? And the journey of the cross and back is Emmanuel.
Right.
God is with us. And so it gives the church the vocabulary then of, if you are hurting, good for you. He is with you. If you are suffering, good for you. He is.
Yes.
So if
Yes.
you're experiencing death, good for you.
Yep.
He is with you. But it's a very common thing to say that God is just found in the joy.
Right.
He's found in the peace. He's found in
hope,
the
yeah.
happiness. And so people fabricate this idea, that everything is fine and everything is great because they want to feel as if God is actually there. But the thing that they are skipping by and bypassing is actually the place that he is dwelling and inviting you
Yep.
in to see yourself clearly.
Yep.
This is why Good Friday is good,
Yep.
because it proves everything to be true. Whenever the people call it out from the beginning, his name is Emmanuel.
Yeah. I forget which day it was this week that we talked about it, but I think it was the Greek Orthodox tradition. One of the days this week, they treat the beginning of Holy Week as the beginning of the wedding ceremony,
Yeah.
where Jesus starts walking down the aisle towards his bride. And the statue of Jesus that they carry in this procession isn't one of him like as whole, but with like the crown of thorns and like the robe over his back and like beaten and bruised. And it's exactly what you're saying. It's like, if we are the bride, the cross is the altar. And every step towards the cross is a step towards us. Like he is
Yep.
coming towards us. Because you can't get married unless you stand where your bride or your groom is standing. And so to stand where we are standing, he has to get to that place.
In the Gospel of John, it's all in a chiasm, and I've
Right.
talked about how there are these parallels, right? And that the chiastic parallel to the crucifixion is John chapter 2. This is the wedding of Cana. And so to understand the wedding of Cana, you have to understand the crucifixion, and to understand the crucifixion, you understand the wedding at Cana.
Yep.
People often will say that the whole point of the wedding of Cana is the first miracle that's turning water into wine. Okay. But
Peace.
like, that's cool. But the truth kind of, there are these vats of baptismal water that is turned into wine and passed out to everyone to drink and to celebrate, because there is a wedding happening. And then the piercing of the body of Christ, there is a separation of water and
Yep.
blood
Yep.
and baptism. And there is a wedding happening between heaven and earth. And John is really intentional about his vocabulary that he picks, of telling his mom in John chapter 2, woman, my time has not yet
Right.
come. And then in the crucifixion story, he says, woman, my time has come. And there's this whole,
Yep.
because there is a wedding happening here. again because it is good, and he has journeyed with us, and this was the end. But it was also the beginning, because at that point he says this Sabbath vocabulary as he dies of "it is finished,"
Yep.
as the sun is going down on a Friday, and this is the beginning of Shabbat and Sabbath, because it is time to pause.
Yeah. There's this line he says before he dies that ties into what you just said. It's one a lot of people who are familiar with this story know. It's like, my God, why have you forsaken me? And there's some tension there because it's like, what? Like, has God like forsaken him? But like, that's the first line of a psalm, and it's Psalm 22. Read it. Read the whole thing. Please read it. But I'll read some pieces to it, because like a lot of the Psalms of David, they start from this place, but then they resolve.
It
in this
is
other place.
proclaiming the victory of
Right.
God.
Like
Right.
here's a few verses from Psalm 22, but read the whole thing. Like, so it starts, my God, why have you forsaken me? But continues, but you, Lord, do not be far from me. You are my strength. Come quickly to help me. For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. And so,
And then it is finished.
and then it
Yeah.
is finished.
Thank you, guys. All right. Well, we'll be back tomorrow with the final podcast, but it's just the beginning, as KJ